computing is all about metaphor, that it's a discipline. We have things like bugs and kernel panic.
What does it look like inside a computer? It could be any kind of magical thing, right?
Sometimes drawing, in my experience, has been a much more profound way for children to explore these concepts and ideas.
Hello and welcome back to the Hello World podcast. I'm Carrie-Anne Philbin, a computing educator telling stories across various types of media, including this podcast.
And I'm James Robinson, a computing educator who works on projects promoting effective teaching and learning within our subject, such as our recently published Big Book of Computing Pedagogy, which is available digitally for free at helloworld.cc/Big Book.
Today, we're thinking about how we help learners understand and get excited about key concepts in computing and asking, what has storytelling and imagination got to do with computing? Question marks, exclamation point, question mark, exclamation one, exclamation, exclamation. And we're joined, thankfully, by three guests, yes, we spoil you, who use stories to support learners in computing education. Quite often, we focus on practicalities of computing and computer science and digital making and all the other good stuff that we talk about here. So, James, I'm interested to know kind of how does imagination fit in?
Well, I think it's a really good question, and I think it may not necessarily be like the most obvious kind of partnership, at first glance. But actually, I think when we're teaching computing, we're teaching lots of really abstract ideas. We're explaining to students how things are working inside this box. There's lots of things that don't have kind of concrete properties to them, and so utilizing the students' imagination to help them visualize those ideas can be a really powerful way to get those ideas across. And storytelling is essentially sort of analogy by a different name. So we're using analogies to help them bridge those conceptual gaps. And I think also through that imagination piece, we can sort of drive motivation. I don't think it's particularly a new idea. I remember many years ago when I was studying for my degree, there was a book.
Was that back in the 1910s?
It was like Abacus was our kind of main computing tool. Thank you, Carrie-Anne.
Gotcha.
So we used a book. There was I can't think of the exact title, but it was called Gödel, Escher and Bach, An Eternal Golden Braid, or something like that. And it was a really beautiful book, and every chapter used a story, like an Edward Lear style story, to kind of explain and explore some really interesting concepts. And so this idea of storytelling and computing isn't really a new thing, but perhaps its use with young children is something that we're kind of starting to kind of reflect on and use more. And ultimately, I think it helps us repack our ideas after hearing a story and help us distinguish what the story kind of told us, and then understand the kind of concepts away from the story. That's a really important step as well. So yeah, I think it's really, really powerful.
Our first guest is children's book author and illustrator who creates whimsical books about computer science. Her series, Hello Ruby, has been translated into over 35 languages. Now she is working on building a playground that allows children to learn how computers work through play. I'm super excited to welcome Linda Lucas to the podcast and ask what excited you about computer science and programming, and how did this lead you to create your character, Ruby?
Well, I started with this O'Reilly book series about learning Ruby on Rails. And you know how the O'Reilly series have these like funny little like animals and so forth. And I figured that, computing is all about metaphor, that it's a discipline that like the ratio of metaphor to reality is very, very high. We have things like bugs and kernel panics and like all these wonderful stories. And then I started to read the book and it was terrible. It was just so dull and boring. And I was bombarded by words I kind of didn't understand and didn't even care about, like what is a variable and like, why do I care how many things I can fit into it? And then out of boredom and out of frustration, I would start to doodle these little characters. And because the language, as mentioned, I was learning was Ruby, I would always imagine a little girl and I would try to imagine how she would explain object-oriented programming or garbage collection or memory management or whatever word I was struggling with. And that's slowly how the series started. So in the beginning, it was mostly for grown-ups, but then when I realized that actually this is what I want to professionally be doing, it morphed into an actual picture book series for children.
And tell us more about her adventures. What does she get up to? What do we learn through her eyes?
So I started already in 2014. So it's almost 10 years that I've been writing these books, and it's a series of 4 books. I started obviously with coding and programming because that was the big thing happening. But I think as we've all kind of realized, it's only a small part of computer science, and there's so much kids should understand about. So she goes on an adventure with her dad and finds hidden gems, but then she also falls inside of a computer, just like Alice in Wonderland, and learns about how computers work. And then in one book, she decides to build a snow internet and learns how the internet is made of hardware and protocols and software, and also the impact it creates to us humans. And then in the final book, which isn't out yet in English, it's a book about machine learning and AI. And in the book, Ruby takes a toy robot to school and learns how in a very different way computers learn about new things than we humans, and what we humans are good at and what machines are good at.
I can't wait to read that new book. That sounds amazing. Might teach me a few things as well.
There was a lot of balancing because we don't know exactly yet what are kind of the AI and machine learning things that we want to be teaching for the young ones. And there's a lot of interesting stuff being done in the US, especially in the K-12, like AI framework group and so forth. But I was struggling a lot, like, should they know about unsupervised learning and supervised learning, or should I just focus on something completely else? And that, I think, is the challenge in writing these books, is a balance of like figuring out what they should learn, what will benefit them in 10 or 15 years time, and what is something that is only relevant for kind of the trendy tech topics of our day.
You talked a bit about what brought you to writing the book was about you kind of understanding some of these concepts. So do you see that as being like a real benefit from using this approach to be able to teach concepts to young people? Is it that it helps teach the concepts, or do you find it's the main benefit is that it brings in a more diverse group of people to those concepts? Like what do you think is the key benefits?
I think when we think about computers, we think that they are machines of math. But then when we look a little bit closer, we realize that there's a lot of like symbol manipulation. There's a lot of kind of logic happening in there. There's a lot of stuff that just can be packaged in a very different way. And they are machines of language also. And in some way, I didn't feel that there was pathways into computer science that took into account the fact that stories are the original way we learn about ourselves and each other and about the world surrounding us. And I figured that we need different kinds of stories about the world of computers as well. It was just something that came very natural to me, and felt that there was this little like, I don't know, nook in the world, or like a little way in, a perspective that I could share.
Also joining us are 2 computing researchers who've been exploring how familiar stories might also help learners access and understand key computing concepts. Lynn Blair is a senior lecturer of computing at Lancaster University and also a primary computing hub lead for Cumbria. And working with her on this project is Sarah Twigg, who's a secondary computing teacher also from the UK. Sarah and Lynn, could you both give us a brief summary of the approach to your research and the question that you were trying to answer?
The question we're trying to answer is basically how can we make computing more accessible to everyone? Because when we were doing our research and the primary school teachers were coming in, a lot of them were saying that they were struggling with teaching the programming side of it, because there are lots of terminology which, if you've not done a computing degree, you don't understand. Like, it's really hard to come across. So with my older sister in primary school teaching, I was like, well, have you tried this way? And showed her the links between, I think it was going on a bear hunt. I was just reading the story to her. I was like, look, there's a repetition. Look, this is where your selection is. And all stories have a sequence. So here's the start, the middle, the end, and so on. So yeah, the main concept was how can we teach it to children, which isn't going to overload them, because of a lot of research into the cognitive load theory. So how can we do it so they actually understand it and they're not going, what on earth is this? Because even in secondary school teaching computer science, you give them something and they just look at you like, what on earth is going on? What are you trying to get across to me? So I think trying to make it relatable to the students, because as James was saying before, computer science is very abstract. So if you can relate it to them and give them a bigger picture of how everything works, then the children are more likely to understand and put it into their long-term memory.
And Lynn, could you give us an example of, Sarah's mentioned like going on a bear hunt there. Is that what other kind of examples of books did you look at? And do you want to elaborate a little bit on the approach you took as well?
Yeah, we looked at one of the big booksellers that go into primary schools and have displays. You know, in my local primary, I went in and they'd got this big display on. And so we went to their online catalogue and we just looked for classic stories that were appropriate for, I think we targeted sort of the 5 to 6 year olds, so that we knew that the reading, the language was going to be accessible to a widest range of children. And out of those, Sarah and I spent a wonderful few days either finding them online or going around charity shops and finding all these books. And I've brought a lot of them out now, so I could remember what all they were. An absolutely lovely weekend, just really going through, seeing which ones had examples of, well, like Sarah said, all of them have in some form or other a form of sequencing in them. But then we were looking at repetition and selection. And we basically coded them up, is what we were saying. We were ticking off which ones had examples of repetition in them, which ones had examples of selection in them. So yeah, that was probably the best part of research I've ever done in my whole career. It was lovely.
I can imagine. And so many of those like young children books have like, you know, physical interaction in some way. Just anecdotally and coincidentally, I was visiting with my family. My niece brought me a copy of The Very Hungry Caterpillar at the weekend to read to her, and she handed me this book, and I went to open it, sat her on my knee, and I was like, "Oh, it's in French." I know this story, but all of a sudden, all the words, all the repetition, all of the sequencing has escaped me, and so I had to kind of like read it from memory because I couldn't quite translate it. My French is not that good. And what did you find from the research that you did? You know, what proportion of books, for example, contained repetition? Was it really prominent within those storybooks, the sort of the computing concepts?
We were trying to spot patterns in those books. I think part of it was just that identification of patterns and then translating that onto what we thought that the teachers and the children could do. So like Sarah said, the repetition was the easier part of it. And then working out that selection on top of that. So it was the big three in computing are that sequencing, that repetition, and that selection. So it's going beyond where we've seen stories used in primary schools before. So stories are such an important part of children's learning, you know, and it's already common to see structured learning activities that are linked to stories. You know, when we go into the classroom, we see that in many different subjects. And so we wanted to apply that to these big three constructs in computing. And, you know, we have physical computing toys that are they're wonderful. Things like Coding Critters, one of my favourites, that you program to move around objects that link to a story. And so it was taking it that one step further. You know, can we do it in reverse? Can we look at those stories and already see these concepts as part of them?
So I had a question for everyone, really. Once our learners have engaged with a story that's helped them understand the concept, how do we then? What's the sort of the next step from that? How do we then kind of convert that or turn that into some kind of application of that learning? And is there a link back to the story when we apply that? And I wonder if anyone's got a thought on that.
I love it. I think it speaks to the richness and also kind of the value of children's literature. And then beyond the kind of the analytical approach, I think there's a lot in the memory. Like we all have these childhood books that we remember reading, and that moment, the kind of qualitative moment when the child reads the book and makes that connection, it will stick with him or her for like years to come, and they will be able to return to it many times over.
So in terms of linking it back to their learning, I think we were trying to produce some sort of template sheet that the children could use. And that was based on, you know, the story had a start point. You were looking for some form of repetition in it. So you'd have sort of an angle bracket that would group together statements that were repeated. And you might have a list of things. So Sarah gave an example of going on a bear hunt. So you might have a list of environments. And in those environments, you did something different. So, you know, if you were in one environment, you would do another thing. So in terms of taking it that bit further, it was really identifying the the patterns that you found in this storybook. So you would read the storybook to start with and see if the children noticed anything. Then you might act it out. I've done some wonderful sort of code clubs that we acted out these stories, and then we tried to find these patterns. So the last point of that, if you wanted to take it further, might be to code it up using one of the block-based languages and working out that mapping from, your initial reading onto the acting out and onto the modelling on paper. You'd tear a piece of paper up, modelling that. And then eventually, if you wanted, you could then see that in some code like block-based
So you're almost
language.
kind of abstracting away, like you're abstracting away some of the detail of the story and all the lovely artwork and the imagery, and reducing it down to its kind of its narrative construct that sort of could be expressed almost sort of algorithmically, and then you're then able to express that through acting, through dance, through a program, ultimately, potentially. So you're kind of pulling out that core element
and then recreating it with imagination, because the beautiful thing about things like Scratch as a language is you can recreate all that. You can put your own artistic interpretation on those different environments. So yes, you are abstracting it away, but I hate to think that element of that story is lost, because that's such a valuable part of the original story. But you're then allowing the children to interpret for themselves and create for themselves how they see it.
Yeah, it's that interpretation bit that also kind of is part of my philosophy, that like the story is a great thing, but then I think the value of the Ruby books is in the activities that allow the children to kind of learn with their fingertips and their like hands and knees, and by like crafting and making things. And as we discussed in the beginning, so many of the ideas of computer science are so abstract that the more tangible, the more real we can make them, the more real they become also to the children. And in some ways, I've even started to think that like often writing at a young age and like storytelling at a young age is a hard skill to get. Or when you're very young, when you're 4, you come up with imaginative and crazy stories. But especially when you're like in school and so forth, like sometimes drawing, in my experience, has been a much more profound way for children to explore these concepts and ideas. And I make them draw like what they imagine is inside of a computer, and I get very different kinds of answers. And that's a basis for like a larger discussion where we always don't have right and wrong answer, but rather like different perspectives.
I love that approach of allowing that creativity into kind of, what does it look like inside a computer? It could be any kind of magical thing, right? Because not everyone understands technology, and then using that to sort of dispel those myths and make it more concrete.
And honestly, there is no right answer for what is inside of a computer, because some of the kids, they draw like the actual components. Some of them draw like the electricity that moves. Some of them draw files and apps. And that is the beauty of computer, that it can take 1,000 forms and have 1,000 faces.
Yeah, and even teaching computer systems and networks, you can also, when teaching input, process, output, you can ask your learners to create devices that do something that is meaningful to them, right? And all they have to do is kind of label, well, this is the input part, this is the process part, and this is the output part. Because really that device could be anything. And I just love that aspect of allowing creativity into teaching computing. And a question I have for all of you is that this feels like a really great approach, but so far everyone's sort of talking about very young age group. And I wondered, how applicable is this approach, do we think, for older learners? I know, Linda, you talked a bit about yourself and teaching yourself as an adult learner, and I would definitely put myself in that category too. But what do we think about sort of teenagers, maybe young adults?
Well, just to go to the other end of the scale, I've got a colleague who used one of Julia Donaldson's books at university to teach recursion. So Charlie Cook's favourite book is absolutely fantastic. So I wouldn't restrict books to primary schools.
Yeah, I'm just clinging on to a Julia Donaldson book, just as Lynn said that, because I'm in my son's room recording this. But they are some of the best books, I think, for repetition and recursion.
Maybe one of the kind of barriers to more using of storytelling is the fact that we tend to take ourselves so seriously as we grow up. And then one way I've been able to sneak in a little bit of stories by talking about metaphors and analogies and so forth for grown-ups. And I think it's a big challenge actually for the tech industry in general, because we have again, like people like Edgar Dijkstra, who was quite cranky, and he said something like anthropomorphizing computers like means professional immaturity or something like that back in the days. And then we have people like Donald Knuth, who said that like the best way to convey information is through a story. And somehow like when we look at academic papers, for instance, like sometimes there are these wonderful stories. I recently read this story about the bubble sort algorithm that kind of it was an anthropological story about the algorithm, and it looked at the efficiency, but then it also looked at like why it became so popular and why do people use it as the first teaching algorithm for sorting. But I think there's a lot we can do ourselves, even in like the higher ed side of things, in like easing in these ideas about story and narrative and metaphor and analog.
And Sarah, you've had some experience, obviously, on the paper and the research you did with primary age students, but now you're teaching secondary. How would you kind of apply some of those ideas to that cohort of students that you're working with now?
So in the school that I currently work with, there's a lot of English and additional language students. So with them, we're currently readapting our curriculum. So I might suggest to the head of department that when we teach the programming element in the future, that we use the children's books and implement the strategies that way. But as one of the teaching standards in the UK is to encourage literacy in the classroom. So in my classroom, I've got a little section of books, and at the end of each lesson, if some of them have finished early, they're allowed to go and read a book. And there are actually books which I think are age appropriate for high school students, so between 11 and 16. I think I might pronounce his name wrong, but it's Jeremy Corbett or something. He does the computational fairy tales, best spell practice, and the CS Detective. And the other day, a kid picked up the CS Detective, and I couldn't stop them from reading. I was like, "It's break time. You need to go." I didn't want to be rude, but I was like, "Come on, it's break time. I want to go and have my break, and you need to go outside and have some fun outside with your friends." And he just sat there reading, which is lovely to see, because as they get into high school, reading's not really something that's deemed to be fun, something that's deemed to be cool. So it was quite nice to see, I want to go read, which is...
It sounds so wonderful, and a wonderful approach that feels like it engages a lot of learners. I think one of the risks around this strategy could be not ensuring we're being culturally responsive and culturally sensitive. I think there's a sort of risk that you reach for your nearest favourite childhood book and actually not just take that extra step to think about the young people that you're working with and how you can best serve them. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
It's a bit of a different thing, but I think it's again like the shape of the stories we tell around technology tend to be very much around like a lone innovator, a lone male white innovator who comes up with something. And that's like something when we talk about the history of technology and tell stories about it, I think we should be very aware of it. And obviously children's books and the classics, but you guys can speak more to that and like what kind of problems they might have. But one of my favorite activities has been one where the children get to like draw illustrations and images of what they imagine computer scientists look like and what kind of problems they solve. And I've had like little girls from Singapore make like computer scientists who look like them and imagine things that they would do. And then a little bit older students in the like high school age students, they would actually go and research some existing computer scientists and like these legendary characters, but then they got bored because they were only men, so they like really needed to dig deep and start to find those like untold stories about other perspectives and other like just more diverse examples of what does it mean to be a person who works in computing. And again, like drawing was a more powerful metaphor for me to explore this subject than writing, but the end results ended up being really, really lovely. And I'll share a few of them.
Yeah, I think that's a really important question in the context that Sarah and I were working in as well. So thank you for asking that, Carrie-Anne. It's really relevant. And I think in most cultures we have that concept of the songs that might have repetition in them, or nursery rhymes, or we can look to other forms and make sure that we are being culturally relevant there.
I want to know what happens next in your research. Like, when will you have your next session where you dig through computers and like children's books, and what are you looking for next?
For me, it's a bit on the back burner because Sarah's got a rather demanding job, and my work sort of transferred into the diversity and inclusion in computing education. So we've been looking into the research around that, and particularly what we can do in higher education to address the not too impressive gender balance that we have at the moment in computing. So there's lots of things. I've got an amazing team that I'm working with at the moment on those areas. So that's the way my research has gone.
Yeah, I was going to say at the moment I've kind of not worked on it for a while, which is really upsetting in a way, because it is my main point of what I want to do. Luckily now I'm working part-time, so I've got a little bit more time spare to do it, because I switched to school up in Bolton, so I do have a few more hours spare, but it went on the back burner, and because of I'm teaching in high school now instead of primary, it was looking more into how can I teach them. But yeah, it's still something that's in the back of my mind going, you need to go back to this research, what else needs adapting? But I think if we change our pedagogy for the younger years in year 7, you'd have those Englishes and seeing how it can include them and doing that approach to it, then that can expand upon the previous stuff, hopefully.
I was going to pick up on something that Lynn mentioned as well, that there is this sort of continued effort around diversity and inclusion. There is, there's some studies going on at the moment looking at the value of storytelling as a pedagogical approach to, there's some sort of, big, the Gender Balance in Computing project is sort of working on this to explore whether this actually has an impact on pupils as a whole, but also specifically girls within computing, whether storytelling is a sort of valuable approach for them. So I think it's going to be really interesting next kind of couple of years as we see more research around this kind of theme to emerge.
I think we can link storytelling to so many different parts of computing though, and like Linda was saying about that creativity through drawing, we've done a lot of work with younger children with physical computing robots, like floor robots, and things like an app called Foldify that you can create, a paper folded version of your favorite animal, say, and stick that onto the robot. And then you can get the children to tell a story about their animal as they move their animal around. So younger children have created stories of hedgehogs hibernating or squirrels going on a hunt for gathering their nuts, all accompanied by a story and a moving floor robot. And that is just amazing. That is computational thinking in practice with storytelling, and it's all bound together beautifully in play. So I just love that side of it pragmatically in schools, and the value there. You can see the children learning, engaging, and having fun.
I think if I can bring in a little tiny bit of educational theory as well, Carrie-Anne, because you know how I like my educational theory. No, so I think all of this stuff that we're talking about here, and when we started talking about stories and analogies, it all fits in really well with the idea that we talk about a lot here at the Foundation of a semantic wave. So the idea that we take an abstract concept, we concretize it, we make it more concrete, but then we don't finish the journey there. We reconnect that to the abstract idea, so we don't leave them in the concrete world. We reconnect with the abstract idea, and I think for anyone looking at storytelling and analogy, that's a really important consideration.
We asked our listeners to share the title and/or image of the cover of a storybook, which they thought would make a great teaching resource for computing. And long-term contributor to Hello World, Matthew Wimpenny Smith, said, "I have used the Hello Ruby books as they are great for teaching in primary schools."
And another contributor, so Joanne L, she wrote in to say that her favourite story was computational fairy tales that they use in Key Stage 2 and 3 when they're introducing programming concepts. And they also love the Dr. Seuss books when teaching compression. which I hadn't thought of, but that's a really good point.
And Neil Howie mentions Lorem Ipsum by Carlos Bueno, which is another great book. I have that one. That's really great for sort of 11-year-olds, 12-year-olds. I find that's a really great book.
And one that I haven't heard of, but I'm going to go and check out, is RoboCat from Pete the Cat series. Was a recommendation from Alison Sheldon, which she recommends is a must-have in early years. So yeah,
and we had a couple of thoughts on this, didn't we, James? We talked earlier about Willow Finds an Egg by our good friend Rebecca Franks, and I was thinking a lot about Here Be Dragons by the late great Chris Leach as well.
Yeah, that's a fantastic recommendation. And I mean, I think also a book that I really love to sort of talk about when we're talking about some of the wider aspects of like learning computing, so like resilience. If you haven't come across the Rosie Revere book, which sort of talks about persistence and resilience and the importance of learning from failure, that's something that I often use with my students to encourage them to embrace the lessons that came from failure.
If you have a question for us or a comment about our discussion today, then you can email via podcast@helloworld.cc, or you can tweet us at helloworld_edu. My thanks to Linda, Lynn and Sarah for sharing their insights with us today. You can read more about Lynn and Sarah's work in issue 6 of Hello World magazine in the article Children's Literature for Computer Science.
You can also read about Linda's approach to programming and play in our big book of computing pedagogy.
So James, what did we learn today?
Well, I think the one thing that I would be doing if I was an educator in the classroom today is reaching for my bookcase, looking for my children's books, flicking through them and looking for those key concepts that we've talked about today. How about you?
Well, that's good. I'm just off now to program the Go Away bird, as that sat right in front of me. Go away, go away, go away!